Okay, we're back once again with the OrgaRetro.com rivalries. If you want to get these jerseys, this sweet Tyrone little number, or that Kerry one that Michael Verney is wearing there, go to OrgaRetro.com and don't forget to use the reference code OurGame and you'll get 15% off the jersey. You couldn't bait it with a stick. Kerry and Tyrone, they wouldn't exactly love each other, Michael, would they?
No, they definitely wouldn't. And it's funny, looking back to the rivalry, haven't met that many times, but over that concentrated period of particularly those three games that we're going to look at in the noughties, it was fairly bitter. And Kerry are so used to winning, to be on the back foot against a team that was anything but a powerhouse and hadn't won an All-Ireland even before they beat them in 03. It must have sickened them a fair bit. Well, we know it did sicken them, and it probably still does.
Yeah, without doubt, because if you've been in a serious rivalry where you've had really close games, as they did, especially the naughty ones, the three games in particular, and you don't win any of them, the fact that Kerry won that qualifier in 2012 when the players are no longer at their peak, it just doesn't count. It'd be like Tipperary having that rivalry with Kilkenny around 9, 10, 11, 12. Tipperary lost most of them, but at least they got 2010. You have something to hang on to as well. So I think that'll be something that Kerry will always struggle with. Even All-Ireland finals, historically, they've played in two. Tyrone have won both of them. Every other game that Kerry won wasn't in an All-Ireland final. So if you're Tyrone, you're feeling pretty sweet about this rivalry.
As well as that, and I'm sure we'll go into it in a bit more detail, like they were the two teams of the decade. They were the two teams of that decade. Kerry got 4 All-Irelands, Tyrone with 3. But when you don't beat the other big powerhouse during that decade, Kerry have more numerically. But you have to say that Tyrone are the team in the decade, even though they've only won 3, because they've basically beaten that Kerry team every time they had met during that decade. So, again, what I said, very, very few meetings over a concentrated period of time, it makes it so interesting. And there's definitely a lot going on in the back of Kerry players' minds from that time that they probably still won't be able to let go for many years to come.
I'm not going to steal it off you, but you had a nice little way of summing up these two teams in terms of how vocal they are and like to talk.
Yeah, no, it's just I was down in Kerry recently enough, and I don't know, they're probably the best storytellers in the country. You think of, the Shanna Keys and everything like that, and they're real kind of, everything is a yarn, everything is a laugh and kind of a story, whereas you kind of think of more Tyrone. I kind of had the Simpsons character Johnny Tightlips. They just weren't going to tell you anything almost. Everything was going to be more maybe covert and more secret. So while it was definitely a clash of football and styles, it was probably a clash of personalities big time as well between the two counties.
Yeah, and as we were going over some of these old games, and they've played 7 times in the championship, and as I said, Kerry have won 4, Tyrone have won 3. But as we were going through it, we started thinking about the sliding doors effect of 2003. At this stage, Tyrone had never won it. They'd obviously dethroned Armagh in the semi-final, really tight game, all that kind of stuff. And, and I just wonder about 2003, actually. I might have those mixed up a little bit. Was 2003 a semi-final? Yeah, sorry, they beat Armagh in the final. But 2003, at that stage, Peter Canavan, he'd never won an All-Ireland, and he was known as the greatest player never to win one at that stage. If they hadn't to get over the line against Kerry that year and ultimately against Armagh, would anything, of what preceded, would that have ever happened? And even Paddy O'Shea, who ended up leaving Kerry after that, what would have happened with Westmeath and so on?
Yeah, the Peter Canavan one is really interesting because it's linked back to Kerry because he picked up that ankle injury against Kerry in the semi-final. He hadn't trained at all in the build-up to the All-Ireland final, and I think it was an hour discussion between him and Mickey Harte on the Friday night where it was decided that he would play or at least start the game. Under no other circumstance in any other game probably would he have been fit to play, but he was fit to play an All-Ireland final. If he hadn't played, we probably would still be talking about Canavan as probably the greatest footballer to never win an All-Ireland, because I don't think if they hadn't won in 03, I don't think they would have won in 05, and I think he probably would have sailed off into the sunset maybe in 04 or 05. And the sliding doors thing is very, very interesting with Paddy, because just going back, it was in January 2003 when Paddy did that interview with Kevin Kimmage in the Sunday Independent, where they sat down and he said, being a Kerry manager is probably the hardest job in the world, because Kerry people, I'd say, are the roughest type of fucking animals that you could ever deal with, and you can print that. And they did print that in the Sunday Independent, and it was kind of something that followed Paddy around for the rest of that year. He kind of had a bullseye on his head for the rest of that year, and then obviously his Kerry managerial career is finished. It goes down like tumbleweed, nearly blown past when they're beaten by Tyrone, totally humiliated. But the flip side of that is, like, Westmeath would never have had their day in the sun if that hadn't have happened. So it's funny, kind of, as I say, as one door closes, another one opens.
And maybe even Laois would have gone on and established themselves more in Leinster, and who knows after that. I saw an interesting quote from Seamus Moynihan earlier in this year when he was talking about the rivalry that they had, and I'll just read out what he said. Tyrone had an exceptional team. We came out of the wrong side all the times we played them. Players like myself, Darragh Canada, Liam Hassett, we were kind of going over the hill. In 2001 I was in a room over in Australia at the international rules. This fella Cormac McAnallen came into the room. He was just after winning an All-Ireland under 21. He was after getting a flight over, but he didn't bother going out, while myself and Darragh went out and had a couple of pints downtown. We knew this fella was training himself. Sean Kavanagh, Brian McGuigan, all these boys were after winning an All-Ireland. Cormac was flying it in training, a fantastic guy. We knew it was coming. It just showed the age gap. There was a difference, and ultimately it did come. They did make hay. 2005 was one that could have gone either way. 2003 was terrible. I wasn't involved in 08. I thought Kerry set themselves up poorly, considering the team that it was all about the two towers, Donaghy and Tommy Walsh, of course, kicking bad ball in. Look, Tyrone deserved to win all 3 days. But that was an interesting one to say, that 2003 was terrible. And he's obviously talking about that from a Kerry point of view. But interestingly, at the time, it was a Kerry man, Pat Spillane, talking about that puke football of Tyrone. Do you know what, looking back, if you were a Tyrone man, and I'm wearing the shirt, you would actually be enjoying that comment, because it just showed how much it stung Kerry that he'd call it puke football. I mean, winning football is the only thing that matters.
Yeah, we had Pat on not too long ago, and his passion for football it's probably unparalleled, really.
Infectious.
But it was very hard to separate the Kerry man and the pundit that day. It was the Kerry man really that made the comment. I'm sure he had the when he called that, because they probably just weren't able to take their beating that day, because it was such a humiliating beating. It really, really was. And when you go back and think about that game, it's always that sequence. When any team is looking for to get intensity or work rate and like that, they'll show that sequence of play at the very start, where I think it's Owen Brosnan that ships the heaviest of tackles, and then Darragh O'Shea tries to take him on as well.
Darragh Canada as well actually manages to ride 2 tackles, to be fair to him.
Yeah, and then it was just like as Pat Spillane said, the intensity of it, and they were hitting everything that moved, and you knew from that opening little salvo that Kerry were just in for something that they weren't prepared for. Funny to hear Seamus Moynihan say that they were a bit over the hill. Tyrone's age profile, apart from maybe Canavan, was perfect for that type of game, for that type of high energy, high intensity game where lads were going to really, really work like dogs and empty themselves. Whereas Kerry, who had always probably prided themselves on being better footballers, when the stakes were really, really raised athletically, they probably weren't able to keep up.
And even that day in 2003, I was just watching back the highlights there, and Ryan McManaman scoring a great point. You wouldn't really think of him scoring points at Croke Park, but he burst away from Gooch and threw one over from around the 45. So that was the 2003 clash. Let's rewind 17 years back to the 1986 game, because this was another one. Like, Tyrone were, again, I was looking back at the highlights, they were well ahead. Then Pat Spillane got a goal, then Mikey Sheehy got the goal. There was a bit of a Tyrone collapse that day, but I'd say they were very much feeling like newbies against a Kerry team that had so many seasoned winners.
Yeah, this was a real kind of live talking point before the 03 game, and even 05 and 08. Tyrone had harboured a lot of hurt probably for a long time, particularly carrying into 03. They were in control in this game. Podge Quinn got a goal in the second half. I think they were either 1-8-4 or 1-8-5 in front. They were 7 points up, and Art McCrory, who was managing the team, came in and he said to bring Eugene McKenna to midfield. So they're bringing him from full forward to midfield. McCrory said, I sensed that we were about to lose our grip. This is despite being 7 or 8 up. since we were about to lose our grip, we needed somebody to steady us down, take the pressure off. McKenna caught one ball, then looked towards the sideline with his arms outstretched. I knew he was gone. He went back to full forward and let her limped off to the sideline. And that was along with Kevin McCabe had missed a penalty as well. John Lynch had to come off, and obviously Eugene McKenna was injured as well. So kind of when you're an underdog like that, you just, even one thing, it's like a domino effect. You see it with a team as well. When a mistake happens in a sequence of play, often another mistake will happen straight away. And this is kind of what happened with Tyrone. It just kind of went from bad to worst. And, the season, Kerry performance took over, Pat Spillane and Mikey Sheehy, and ended up winning, I think, by 8 in the end. But it was far from comfortable. It was very, very uncomfortable for a long time. But it probably, in an inadvertent kind of way, probably sowed the seeds for what would come. They wouldn't make mistakes against Kerry the next 3 times they met them in really, really big games.
And you're talking about that collapse there. I think everyone who's played GA at some stage has been on a field, and you'd be going so well, and then all of a sudden the sky is falling around you, and you just don't know how to stop it. It's like trying to put your hand up and stop a river. It's just pouring through no matter what.
Yeah, and because you're not experienced, or maybe you're lacking leaders, particularly in those type of situations, I know it's sportsmanship or gamesmanship or whatever, you do need somebody to go down. You do need something to happen. You do need something to buy time to get a message onto the field or rearrange yourself, or they wouldn't have done it back then, but maybe you do it now. Pull back a sweeper for 5 minutes and shut up shop or something like that. But when that's a new situation to you, you need everything to go perfectly for you, because even the smallest thing like that can just set about a change of events that can just completely change a game.
Yeah, so we'll jump on to 2005 then, as we've already covered 2003. One thing that stood out again, watching back the highlights a little while ago, was, we've got that lovely finish for the Peter Canavan goal where he comes off the shoulder of Owen Mulligan and just slides it into the corner. Really lovely finish.
Can I just say something to you about that goal? That goal, every time I watch back, and I remember thinking at the time, it's almost like time is standing still. And even he side foots the ball, and it's not as if it rockets into the net. It's just perfectly placed, and you're just kind of looking at it, and it's one of them weird things when you know what's going to happen even before it happens. And I just thought, even when I look back at it now, it looks like it's still happening in slow motion. It was just a perfect move, and it was the opposite way around. It wasn't teacher and student. It was student offloading to teacher. I thought it was brilliant.
And I'll try to remember to put the video of that goal in the rivalry video underneath on ourgame.ie. But what really stood out to me was the underrated catch from Owen Mulligan. So it was a ball that was sent in 50 or 60 yards, and he got up so high from full forward, just on the edge of the square, snapped it, and then had the presence of mind. I mean, there's a lot to be said for the presence of mind when there's 80,000 people around you to actually have the calmness to do the right thing.
Did you see him he was waiting for Canavan though?
Yeah.
It's like he knew he was going to be there, and that's kind of the telepathic kind of nature between two players that played together for a good number of time and knew each other well. He actually caught the ball, as you say, an unbelievable catch, and it's like he left and right, and he was kind of just waiting for him to be there, and he was there, of course.
Yeah, and Tyrone won that game 116 to 210. Brian Dooher as captain. I mean, you had Canavan a couple of years ago, but Dooher, what a player he was around that time, especially, and 2008 also, just irrepressible.
Unbelievable player. One of the other big takeaways though from that 05 final was Gooch got some sort of a knock or something relatively early in the game.
Yeah.
Don't know if it was to his face or whatever, but it definitely totally lessened his impact in the game. And I'm not saying that anything untoward happened or whatever, but
you're certainly hinting at it.
Tyrone were very, very well versed at those little small things that could upset a lad and maybe turn a game, and it might have seemed relatively innocuous at the time, but it had a big impact on the rest of the game, and definitely had a big impact on his influence in the game.
Yeah, and then 2008, so that was probably clashed to see who the team of the decade was, and Tyrone ended up winning 115 to 14 points. And I do remember that day thinking, Declan O'Sullivan is in such brilliant form here, he's going to be hard to keep down. And I think, especially the way the things had happened for Tyrone, like the night before the game, I think John Devine, who was the goalkeeper, his father passed away, and Pascal McConnell ended up in goals. And I mean, of course, that's fairly unsettling for the panel. It's going to be tough on Pascal, of course, in a fairly, kind of tame enough way compared to what John Devine was going through. But, obviously they're pretty unsettling to go into a team the day before in All-Ireland. He ends up making a couple of good saves. Hub Hughes comes on at half time. His burst through the centre ends up with a goal for Tommy McGuigan, and the fact that the Twin Towers were nullified by the McMahon brothers. So I think my memory of it is that Tyrone were the better team, and I hear Kerry people saying that they probably did enough to kind of, in the first half, forge themselves a lead. But I think very much my opinion was they were the better team. Brian Dooher, obviously absolute class act, and there was no real doubt by the end of it who was the better team.
It was funny because Kerry obviously had that fairly scenic route to an All-Ireland earlier in that decade, when they went through, I think they went through the guts of 10 games as well, and Tyrone went through 10 games to win an All-Ireland in 08. But as you say, like, Pascal McConnell came in, he made a brilliant save just before half time, and I just watching the clip back there, the ball ended up with Brian Dooher around the 65, maybe about 70 or 80 yards from goals, and he just tears in along the sideline, basically, was nearly knocked out twice, and held his composure, put over a great score. And that was just before the break kind of settled them down. But Tyrone were definitely the better team that day. I remember Tomas O'Shea getting a late goal to bring Kerry back into, I think they were 6 down. He hit a belter of a goal nearly in the last minute off the crossbar and in. But the big thing was that the Twin Towers were nullified, something that we probably didn't see coming, really, because it's like anything, when it's going well, you don't see how it can be stopped. Tyrone took a definitely different kind of action to try and thwart them with Justin and Joe McMahon, but it definitely worked. And even though Tommy Walsh ended up as Young Footballer of the Year, I think that year, wasn't it, his impact on the game and Donaghy's impact on the game were greatly reduced.
So 2012 then, Kerry win by 10 points down at Fitzgerald Stadium, but definitely it felt like it was after the fact. This was a Tyrone team that were pretty much going nowhere at the time.
It was trying to be. They tried to build it up as a chance for Kerry revenge, but it wasn't really, and it felt unbelievably tame after. I remember Paul Galvin, after he was interviewed after, and it's just like, yeah, it's not like these aren't the boys that caused us so much pain during the noughties. It's not. Yeah. It's a different crew completely, and the fact that they were beaten kind of so limply kind of summed up that, really.
And my memory too is Kerry were unbelievably cynical in the last 10 minutes. That everything that Tyrone had done to them in the previous years, they were using every chance to foul, slow up play. So they probably drove rubbed their noses in it a little bit in that sort of sense. Then 2015, the All-Ireland semi-final, Kerry 18 points, Tyrone won 11. My memory of that is that I think Tyrone left a good chance behind them that day. And even 2019 then, I think we all saw last season, Kerry won 18 points for Tyrone, and that was probably the day when Cathal McShane sealed his All-Star award. But definitely in recent years, Kerry have had the edge. But Colm Cooper was asked about the rivalry, and just read out a small bit of what he had to say. And he said, "We had great battles with them in 03, 05 and 08, and they came out on top in each of those battles. Is bitterness too strong a word? It was very intense with the players and supporters, but it has moved on because the only person there who's common is Mickey Harte. Even at this stage, everyone else is gone. I don't think it carries as much. People will understand that there's rivalry on both sides, but it isn't as intense as it was. But by God, it was when it was flying."
Oh, it definitely was, yeah. Isn't it funny he mentions Mickey Harte there? It is phenomenal when you think back. You're thinking back, basically, take out 86, you're thinking back to the start of this rivalry. Is 03 and it's finished in 19. Obviously will continue maybe this year and next on, and Mickey Harte is really the only common denominator throughout that period of time. So it's phenomenal, really. His 3 All-Irelands obviously came during that decade. They haven't won All-Ireland since they've beaten an All-Ireland final by Dublin obviously in 18, but just to have that longevity, no more than a Brian Cody or an Alex Ferguson in soccer, it's unreal to be there that long and to be still have your voice heard and to be respected that much. It's phenomenal, really.
And we always like to compare a couple of players in these rivalry series, and we've very much got 2 cheeks of the one arse here with Brian Dooher and Paul Galvin, haven't we?
Without a doubt. Even when you're comparing some players and you're comparing them, but they're not necessarily the same number. These boys are the same number and everything, and nearly always played that 10 position, that half forward position. I thought you might have gone with a tighter haircut just to represent kind of Brian Dooher's kind of far from flowing locks maybe, but I tell you what, he was always in full flow on the pitch. He was, just listen back to some of the commentary there, and Ger Canning says he was the heartbeat of that Tyrone team, and he really was, because obviously Canavan was struggling a bit in the 03 final, but in 05 and 08 he really lifted it on, and as captain both years. And do you know when a lad leaves that much of a legacy behind, like forever, I think that outside of the right foot kick, I'll always, I can't think of another player that I would credit that to more than him. I can't think of anybody basically that kicked it more off the outside of the right than he did, and rarely saw him put one wide, and he had a knack of always putting them over when they really needed one as well.
Yeah, they were both energizer bunnies, to be fair to them. Both brilliant at just winning ball, dirty ball out around midfield, but they both had a score in them as well. Little wonder that they both won 3 All-Stars. Of course, Galvin has the edge with the 4 All-Irelands compared with 3 for Dooher, but he was captain for 2 of them. Tough to call between them. I'm going to go with Dooher though.
Galvin probably changed the perception of what a half forward was, and even like we talk about the hurling half forwards now, Paul, they are kind of what Paul Galvin was 15 years ago. They're dropping that far back, they're going into kind of breaking ball, kind of ruck ball, they're getting on ball, they're not necessarily scoring. They're good on the ball, but maybe won't hurt you on the scoreboard. And that's kind of, he probably changed that role. He probably changed that role about 15 years ago. Massive physicality, massive energy required. Again, when your body starts to let you down a bit, you can't do what you once wanted to do. No more than Dooher couldn't do what he wanted to do or what he was used to doing towards the end of his career. But in his pomp, absolutely unbelievable. Footballer of the year, he was the 1000th All-Star. You say the same amount of All-Stars. He's won more All-Ireland, I think, if not 2. I just think Galvin kind of, Galvin broke the mold for what a half forward was supposed to be. And I know I said there that maybe necessarily the half forwards don't need to be unbelievably good in the ball, but he was dynamite on the ball as well. A really, really underrated player actually in terms of his actual ability, his footballing ability. Galvin would just tip it for me, I'd say. Probably the fact that I'm in this probably doesn't exactly doesn't help the argument. I'm definitely going to back up the Kerry man in this instance.
Okay, well that's it from the Kerry versus Tyrone rivalry. If you have any thoughts on it, if you think that Galvin is better than Dooher or otherwise, please let us know. And don't forget, if you want to get these jerseys, go to orgaretro.com, put in the promo code OurGame and you get 15% off. Thanks very much, Michael.
Thanks a million, Jen.